Hello and welcome to this webinar that we're having today. I want to welcome everyone who's joining us live as well as those who are joining us virtually sometime in the future, I guess it would be. My name is Jon Kay. I'm the Director of Traditional Arts Indiana, a statewide folk arts program. It's a partnership between Indiana University and the Indiana Arts Commission. And I'm really excited about doing this program. This is an area of interest for me for the past several years. And so we're going to be talking about memory art and aging, lessons on successful aging in the arts. But first, before we get too far into our program, I should make sure that we thank our sponsors. As I said, we're a partnership between the Indiana Arts Commission and Indiana University. And I should have that IU logo there. I'm doing badly here. But anyway, and we receive funding also from the National Endowment for the Arts. And this year, we're very fortunate. We're doing this project in coordination with the Creative Aging Festival. It's the 4th annual Creative Aging Festival here in Bloomington, Indiana, where we're broadcasting from. And I want to thank them for including us in on this. We did receive a technical assistance grant, a capacity building grant, rather, from the Indiana Arts Commission to do this webinar series. And we told them up front that we wanted to make sure we did one program that was especially geared towards folk art and aging, because we see that as being a really important topic for us. So I'm going to keep moving on through our program, but thank you to all of our sponsors and our supporters. This is one of those projects that's really been a long time coming for me. For almost, for at least 20 years, I've worked as a professional folklorist, and most of the time in doing my work, I've interviewed seniors, often trying to document ideas of cultural heritage, trying to discover community aesthetics and community values, and I often find myself talking to among the very senior in a community to find out about them. This is me at a Florida Humanities Council project probably 15 years ago with Junior Mills, a whip maker down in South Central Florida, and I was talking with him about his traditions. But most of the artists I've worked with over the years, occasionally I work with younger artists, but often the folks that we end up working with are among the most senior. And there are many reasons for that. One is seniors have time. Two, it might be the type of people we look for. They have an appearance of being, quote, more authentic or something. But I think there's also more going on with what folk art, what traditional arts, what the arts in general do for seniors. And that's what I want to try to explore in the next few minutes with you this afternoon. Really got thinking about this a lot a few years ago. I made a documentary film with Harold Stark. Harold, for over 30 years now, has been a demonstrator up at the Indianapolis State Fair. And he built his own little half-size steam engine tractor. And he uses that to plow fields and run buzz saws and drive in tractor show parades and a variety of other programs. But the work that it does, plowing and powering things, is only part of what it does, I discovered. And in talking with him, it's really intended to be something to show, something to exemplify, something that would open up a channel for him to be able to talk to people about his life growing up on a farm in Rush County with his grandfather who used to farm with a steam engine. Way for him to both invoke them or to talk about them, but also to thank them and to tell other people about his heritage and his past, his background, his past. So when I talk about this idea of folk art, what am I talking about? You know, in some sense, you know, Harold's art that he made, the steam engine, it's not a folk art, isn't a traditional art. It wasn't necessarily passed down to him how to build steam engines, although he did learn from his grandfather how to maintain and repair them. Um, it's more for him a reflection of his culture, a reflection of his family, and a reflection of his community. So when we're talking about what are the folk arts, I like to think about folk art as being a type of folklore. And I'm a folklorist, as probably most of you know. And one of the popular definitions of folklore is its artistic communication in small groups. And so it's a way in which a person communicates one to another. This is just one definition. Another definition could be expressive culture in community, things that people make that are rooted in place and rooted within a social group. And it means that we are looking at something that is socially situated, something that is the social side of the arts. So you have someone like Ruth Newmister from up in Upland, Indiana, who had for many, many years been doing tatting, and tatting is definitely a traditional art. But she wanted to do more with her tatting, and she used to love to garden and to grow flowers around her house. But as she got older, she had fewer and fewer garden spots and flowers that she could tend to because it was difficult for her. So she started doing floral arrangements, not with actual flowers, but by tatting them and making them into little bouquets and framing those and using those to show to people and show her talent, and her sense of color was just beautiful. So we're talking about things that are rooted in place, things that are passed from socially around, maybe not the techniques, but the understanding of them are communicated socially. And it's a form of artistic communication, you might say. So when I work with Dee Neerman down in Brownsburg, not Brownstown, Brownstown, Indiana, who makes rugs, she's a fifth generation rug maker, but she makes rugs in part to sell. That's part of the utility of them. But she also makes them to enlarge her social community. People come and they buy rugs from her, and she's able to communicate with them, and she is able to form connections with people that are around her. Or or Elmer Schlinsker. Elmer is a broom maker, was a broom maker, passed away recently. And Elmer didn't learn how to make brooms from his father. He was around his father making brooms. But it wasn't until he retired that he started teaching himself by memory the things that his father had shown him, as well as by taking some of his father's old brooms apart. And he was able to reteach himself the art of broom making. Was it because he needed brooms? Not really. It had to do with the fact that he was approached about, could you do some demonstrations at Lanesville, a little festival that happens down in the southern part of the state? And he started demonstrating his broom making for them. And that enlarged his circle and provided a social connection that he was able to make with other festival goers and artisans and community members. And he was able to forge a whole new identity for himself as a broom maker, and while he was able to talk about his father and talk about the importance of this craft to the local community. I could go on and talk about the art that's traditional, but then there's a lot of art that is not necessarily a tradition that's evident, like the work of Glenn Hall. Glenn Hall lives down in Paoli, Indiana, and does these just amazing metal sculptures. He's a retired farmer, did a lot of repair work on farming equipment and stuff. And he found that he's always had this kind of a wonderful imagination. And once he retired, he had a little bit more time on his hands, and he started making things out of the pieces of scrap metal that they had around the farm. And as he made things, people would stop and see his yard art that he had and talk with him. And he loves to talk and visit with people. And there's just all types of art that kind of follows this borderline between art that people make that's part of a tradition, and art that people make that's kind of idiosyncratic or kind of individual in the way it's made. Uh, Quilts, by far, have been around forever and for a long time, and traditional patterns and stuff. But when Amy Powell made this rug, she was actually trying to come up with a rug, a quilt that would allow her to tell the story of her family. And so she made this, put the pictures in there, and it becomes this kind of genealogy project for her, a way that she can communicate with her family and share the importance of this. And it brings everybody together in this one narrative frame. So I'm going to lay out the basic point of what I'm going to talk about this afternoon. There are seniors all over the world, definitely all over Indiana, that make crafts, that make things, play music, do cooking, any type of artistic expression. People like John Bontrager, an Amish man from up in Shipshewana, Indiana, that loves to make rugs, and he started making rugs after his wife passed away and after he had to give up farming. But he makes them to sell, but that's not the only reason that he makes them. The utility is far greater than just having floor coverings or the little bit of money that it would make. It's able to fill up the time when he's alone by himself in his farmhouse. It is able to provide him a little bit of income. It's able to provide a social life for him where he's able to go to the Center for Traditional Arts in downtown Shipshewana and do demonstrations and show people his craft by tying knots in the rugs. And it kind of enlarges his community. But the memory art projects that I'm going to talk about are a little bit different than that. While this provides a lot to John Bontrager, it's not necessarily the same as the work that someone like Eli Jackson, who it was a maker of canjos and hamdolins. That's a mandolin made out of a ham can. Eli grew up in Kentucky, grew up during the Depression. He remembers as a small kid stealing a piece of screen wire out of his mother's back door screen, and he would use that to make a little one-string instrument with a little coffee can or a little tin can. And it was from there he graduated to making banjos and dulcimers and different things like that. But he didn't start those when he was a young man. He started remembering that little one-string instrument he made all those years ago. And when he reached retirement age, he started again building instruments. Didn't just make them to sell, although he did sell a few. He made them to show kids how you could make music out of just about anything. He started going to schools and doing school programs. So where John Bontrager's rugs are able to provide him sociality and to provide him a little bit of money and a hobby that actually fills the time, Eli actually is able to do all of those things, but he also adds this aspect of reflection, of life review. The making of instruments became this tool for him, not just to play music, which he did, but to actually talk about the past and to talk about what life was like when he was growing up and to reflect and to make sense out of, the situation where he grew up and the life that he had, and to try to negotiate and find himself to be basically the same person that he was all those years ago. So that's the basic tenet, this idea of life story objects. So I'm going to share with you just a few examples of some of the people that I've met over the years and some of the things that they made and the stories behind them. And I'm not doing this to say everyone should go out and start doing memory painting, or everyone should go out and start doing wood carving, or whatever the case may be. I'm just trying to help provide seniors with some ideas about some of the things that they can do in their senior years that actually can provide a certain amount of fulfillment for them. And I'm also, on the flip side, trying to help caregivers and families to come to better terms of understanding, why is grandma still making all those quilts? Her closets are filled with them, her bedroom's filled with them. We've got to come up with something else. It's just stuff. And I hear that from lots of people. It's just stuff. It's so much stuff. Well, sometimes you have to look a little bit beyond what's evident and see that there's a lot more going on there. And I want to talk about some of the people that I've had the good pleasure of getting to know over the years. Once I started looking for life story objects, I started seeing them all around. I was just up at the state fair last summer, and I bumped into a neighbor of mine, Bill Root. Bill Root's a great wood carver. Carves everything from life-size sculptures to beautiful Remington-style wood carvings. But when he went to the state fair, a place where heritage and history are very heightened there in the Pioneer Village area where he was demonstrating, he chose to build a house, an old house, a historic house. But he also took great delight in the fact that he was able to tell people this was the house that he grew up in, down in Vincennes, Indiana, and had a newspaper clipping that had a little bit of the history of this old house. But it became not just a historical home or a dollhouse, but actually a focal point for him to talk a little bit about his youth. And so the secret to these life story objects is that they're basically structured for three basic phases. And you could probably break this down into many more, but I'll stick with three for right now. There's this time for people to reflect, time to think about things, to reminisce, and to review their life. And that can be a very long process for people. It's not something that people do in just a day. You can think about lots of the people that you talk to, seniors that you go, and they love to talk about the old times. Well, one of the things that making life story objects do is they kind of get a free pass. If someone's actually making something, a quilt or wood carving or something, and there's some physical product from them actually making, from their time they spend, it's not bad for them to reminisce and to do life review and reflect upon their life. Where someone is just doing it and they're talking and they're just sitting around reminiscing all the times, as a culture we tend to be less tolerant of it. But this idea of making actually opens up a door for people to be able to spend more time in personal reflection. And it used to be thought by gerontologists that this idea of reflection or life review or reminiscence, more appropriately, was a bad thing, that it was just being kind of caught in this endless loop about the past. But a gerontologist by the name of Robert Butler in the 1960s came around with the idea that, actually, this is a natural part of the aging process. He believed to be a universal aspect of it. And the fact that everyone, if they live long enough, should spend some time in reflection and life review as a way of kind of coming to terms and finding satisfaction in their life. And it seems like these material forms, these life story objects, are a really wonderful way for people to find a way to reminisce and to make these things. Now, you can do reminiscence and life review by yourself. You can just kind of sit and think about things. You can even make things by yourself, and lots of people do. But when you blend those two together, very, very often this third component comes about, this idea of sharing. And so you can reflect upon it. It leads to the construction of this thing. The thing that you've made then becomes this story object, this life story object, that then, because it's visibly evident, you're able to share it, whether it's a walking stick or whether it's a painting or whether it's a wood carving or a quilt, whatever it may be. because it has a certain materiality to it. You're able to share it with other people. And then when you share it, you're actually able to tell its story, or the story that it seeks to communicate, to someone else, which provides you yet another opportunity to reflect, and you make it new again in story. And so there's this kind of ongoing cycle. So lots of people may start to make just one object, and they end up making many, many objects over the years. One of the first artists I want to tell you about is a good friend of mine, Marianne Sykes, that lives up in Chesterton, Indiana. And I first came to know Marianne when an email alert came to me that there was a new instance of the phrase folk artist on the internet in Indiana. And so I went and I looked for her, and I saw Marianne's work, and I was looking at the work of other rug hookers. They like to call themselves rug hookers. And I noticed hers seemed to be not the visual patterns that you normally see, the floral patterns and those sorts of things, but actually had people and looked as if they would actually tell a story. And I drove up to Chesterton and sat down and met with her, and I learned about her life. Now, Marianne had a kind of a rough life. She grew up at the Angel Guardian Orphanage in Chicago. Her mother died when she was just a baby, or just a young child, and her father didn't have money to take care of Marianne and her sisters. And so she grew up basically in an orphanage from about the age of 3 to about 14. But a couple weeks out of each year, she'd get to leave this orphanage, and she'd go to her father's neighborhood, and she'd get to stay with him for a couple weeks. And that was a place in Chicago called Little Italy. And she made this rug to commemorate those visits and stuff that she had. The kids roller skating, knife sharpener out on the street sharpening people's knives, the carriage, the woman out on the street with all the kids hanging out of the windows, just all types of fun things within this narrative scene. Now, anyone that does the history of Chicago will quickly find out that Angel Guardian was a very abusive orphanage. And one of the really sad parts is the fact that it was especially abusive for people of Italian ancestry. And Marianne was very much, she and her sisters were singled out often for special abuse. Now, she's never made any of these rugs to commemorate those bad memories that she has, even though her children have asked her to. But she uses them not just to record history or to record the past, but to come up with nice stories, to put happy memories together, like the time that she spent with her father, a happy time. Or it could be these objects that tell stories like this one of her kids when they were little, going trick-or-treating. And so a lot of the times she lived vicariously through her own children being robbed of her own. And so she's able to use these kind of like the rosary beads of her youth to sit and think and dwell and meditate on those happy times and to relive them again. This is a picture of the worst snowstorm in Chicago when her kids were little, and I thought it'd be really good for you all to get to hear a little bit of Marianne describing this. I will warn you to I think the volume should be fairly consistent, but you may want to adjust your volume.
My son made a big igloo with his friend, and they had a little dog. They put it at the top, and it would run out the bottom. It was one of these little mousy dogs. They called him Mousy. And my daughter Barbara was selling 2 snowballs for 5 cents so they could throw. But kids were playing snowballs, hitting everybody. And there's this street. And the police were called several times for the igloo on the ground. The kids were noisy. That's where we lived. That's where I raised the kids.
Right.
These were cold water flats, they called them. So this was the one I owned with the red door. They were narrow buildings, 19 feet wide, 60 feet long. You raised your kids there. It was miserable. Very narrow steps, you know.
So that's Marianne talking about her home and her children there in Chicago. And one of the things I wanted to point out was she said, "Oh, that's my house there in the back, the Coldwater flat with the red door." When I asked her, "Well, was the door really red?" She goes, "No, no, I put it there to make it stand out so I could tell people about it." So these rugs are made not just to have a mental image for the person. They're not just made to be visually pretty, but to be also pretty to recall and easy to tell. They become these kind of narrative tools, more than props. They're not just props. They're actually what I would call an intertextualized story, a story that's been bound together and is just waiting there in earnest for somebody to look upon it and to say, "Oh, what's that?" And she could launch into her own story. I first encountered this phenomenon that at least became aware of it. I'm sure I was around it my whole entire life and didn't realize what was going on. But when I met a man by the name of John Schoolman, John lived to be 100 years old and stayed artistically active all the way through his life. And John grew up in near Peru, Indiana, up in the northeastern part of the state. And he always loved to go on hikes and walks. And he lived with his wife Ada for many, many years. They in a little town called Bippus, Indiana, and they'd always go for hikes, and they'd go and enjoy the countryside. And even when I met John years later, he was walking sometimes 4 and 5 miles at a stretch. And John is just really a wonderful person. One of the neat things about John is that after his wife passed away, he developed a whole new life for himself. He developed a craft of making these incredibly beautiful walking sticks.
And he used to go out back here, brushy back here, and dig up some sticks and make little walking sticks, and that grew into it, and it kept growing. And those early ones didn't amount to much, and I threw a lot of those away, but I have a lot of them now. I enjoy it. I enjoy for other people to enjoy them. It's a lot of fun. I go out on an old country road where they cut and made a stiff bank, and those little trees or shrubs come out, and they made a perfect handle. And I dig those out. Those are hardwood, oak and ash and so forth. And then I got onto this sumacs all along the roads, anywhere you can find it. And you drive down the road and see one, you get out and cut it off or dig it out. And I stuck pretty well, and they're lightweight and easy to work. And I may set them up here and look at them for a day or two, or a week or two, or whatever. Or once something will pop into your head, so you start in. It just grows on, and you may get halfway through and change your mind and go some other way. But it's keeps my mind busy, keeps me going.
So that's John Schoolman's work. John probably made well into the thousands of walking sticks. I went and photographed many of his works last year, and I think we did over 1,000 walking sticks in a day. Just truly an amazing artist, very prolific. And one of the sticks that he made was one that was called Schoolman's General Store, which is basically a walking stick that tells the story of he and Ada's life together. And you can just imagine this little old man walking down the streets in North Webster or someplace around northern Indiana where he lives, and someone will see this really colorful walking stick, and they'll come up to him and they'll go, "Oh, what a pretty stick." And he'll hold it up for them to look at, and then he's got them, kind of like a fishing lure. It just kind of grabs a hold of them. And he's able to tell them, "Oh, this is a poem I wrote for my wife." And he reads them the poem. "Oh, and here's this insignia about the general store. Oh, yeah, we used to own a general store. Or here's the name of the church where we used to worship." And all these different aspects are incorporated in in the walking stick that he makes. And he would carry these different sticks that he would make to the little community center called Speck up in North Webster. And people would always be anxious to see what type of walking stick he was going to walk in with that day. Another artist that I worked with was a man by the name of Gus Podov, Gustav Podov. And Gus is another pretty resilient person. He was born in Dutch Indonesia. His father was German. His mother was Indonesian. And he grew up also in an orphanage when his father died and his mother was unable to take care of him. And one of the interesting things about him was the fact that he, right after he graduated or got out of school, he went into the military, World War II, and was instantly captured by the Japanese. He became a prisoner of war. I think he was only 17 at the time and was in the Dutch tank battalion. And he spent 4 years helping build the Death Railway. Many people would know that it's along the Burma-Thailand line. Was featured in the movie Bridge on the River Kwai. And he was one of the imprisoned workers that helped do that. And he hates that movie that records that. He wants to tell his important story, his own story of what it was like. And so he's got this very thick accent, difficult to communicate. And so he started painting because he would go on Tuesday mornings and meet with the other veterans from Columbus, Indiana. And he would volunteer there, and people couldn't understand what he was saying. But once he started making these paintings, he was able to tell all types of stories that tell about his very harsh imprisonment that he had. Once he started getting an audience for his paintings, he started painting them and giving them away to a whole variety of people. He started painting stories, not just scenes of the bridge, but actual narrative scenes about when he had to trade his clothes, his shirt, his coat for some nutrition, for some sugar, and how he stole it back. And even though he knew that stealing was wrong, he could see the all-seeing eye of God looking down upon him. So that was one of the artists I've worked with from Columbus. Another one is actually going to be joining me tomorrow at a lecture that I'm going to do with the Creative Aging Festival, Bob Taylor. And Bob is a memory carver that carves these beautiful wooden scenes. This is the first one that he did. It's the Mission Festival that he remembers from his childhood. And he decided after he retired that he wanted to carve a scene from his childhood. And so he used the making of this scene as a way to ease into retirement, you might say. He went and talked with all of his cousins who were playing baseball there in the lower part of the scene. He went back to the old church and schoolyard and looked for where the trees had once been, and started looking for old pictures and things. And it gave him something to do, to research and to draw. And he'd spent actually a very long time making each one of his, making this carving as well as all the subsequent ones. He enjoys the researching that goes into it as well. So you have people like Bob Taylor and Gus Podov, and you also have people like Marianne Sykes and Eli Jackson, all doing these objects that are about memory and about remembering very particular times in the past. Now, these examples that I've given you are all contemporary artists for the most part, people who have been doing this that I've actually had the chance. But a while back, I stumbled onto a newspaper article about a man that was named George L. Lucas. And George Lucas, no one of the fame of Star Wars. George was retired in 1928, and he started making these model trains with which were like as accurate as you can make them, with automatic couplers and steam engines. And Mr. Lucas was a retiree from the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company, where he made train cars. And he made sure he painted them as accurately as possible, and he used real tin and wood and railroad paints to make them just as well as he could. And he would give those to his grandson sometimes. And he'd spend long hours working in the wintertime around a wood stove making these things. Now, I can't say how long people have been making life story objects, but for sure, ever since there's been something known as retirement, people have probably done this. And I think there's some kind of universal aspects of Mr. Lucas's trains that you find in all of the people that I've talked about here. First of all, he started making his trains after he retired. It was something about that onset of retirement. Some scholars have noted that there are these rites of passage in our lives, those times that people actually spend. There are these rites of passage in people's lives. There's these things like marriage, bar mitzvahs, baptisms, whatever they may be. And each one of those has these certain series of things that you go through. You're single, and then you get engaged. And then you go through a marriage ceremony, and you come out on the other side married with new rights and responsibilities and expectations. Well, retirement is a type of rite of passage like that. But the difficulty is that you are working, and then you have this retirement, maybe a retirement party, some type of celebration of all the time you've worked, and then you retire. But the issue is that there's not something that you retire to. And all of the artists that I talk with have really thrived in retirement because they've actually found something to redefine them. They found, John Schoolman became the cane man in his local community. Bob Taylor's an incredible wood carver and has been his whole life, and this carver of memories is something for him. Marianne has developed a whole community of people in the local rug hooking club who call her their Grandma Moses, you might say. And so they've become this way of having whole new identities. One of the other things that they talked about in the article about Mr. Lucas that was this common trait with the other people that I talked about, and that was the fact that they worked when they were alone. Now, I think this is important because so much of the arts and aging programs that happen all over the United States are designed as workshops, and you come in and you bring your memories and you work on them together and you show your stuff to other people. And from the work that I've done talking with all of these seniors over the years, the reality is people like to spend large amounts of time alone reflecting, making, reworking, remaking, and then sharing. And so it's not something that necessarily, not that the art programs aren't good to do them, have an afternoon of watercolors, be great and very entertaining, but it doesn't accomplish the same types of things that, the making of these trains or the doing of the wood carving or the walking sticks or the rag rugs are going to do for some of the other seniors. So they invest long periods of time in this. They work when they're alone. They invest, the third thing is they invest these long periods of time. Bob Taylor, he would spend months researching all types of historical facts. He would do sketches and drawings and research and resketch and redraw. Marianne would do the same thing, spend large amounts of time drawing and sketching and reworking. Not just reworking their art, but actually reworking their memories, helping to distill them down into reflectable parts of their stories. They also employed materials that were significant to them. Some of those materials are significant because of personal history. Bob Taylor started carving when he was 8 years old. Mr. Lucas started making trains using the materials he worked with as a train builder in his occupation. Gus, his reason for creating his paintings is not because he grew up in a tradition of it, but because they functionally work. Flat things hang on walls where he would go and he'd volunteer and he could stand next to them and talk about them. They work situationally. Marianne's rugs work because there was an active rug hooking club there in Chesterton that she was able to connect with. And John Schoolman's sticks worked because they would garner attention as he walked around his local community. So those are just some of the things that they would do. And I think the most important one is the fact that they would use their objects that they would make, the products of their long times of reflection, to actually make serious connections with other people. Well, I've run longer than I intended to, but I think that there's a lot more that we could talk about. So you get to just the so what of all of this. The main thing is that the creative process has long been understood by gerontologists and social workers as good for the ongoing mental and physical health of seniors. Staying creative throughout their life. There's a recent study about the benefits of learning something new in their senior years and actually keeping the brain healthy. Material forms of reminiscence or making and sharing of life story objects provide a useful outlet for seniors to think and to come to terms with their lives as a way for them to package and to reflect upon their history. And the most important thing I wanted to point out was, while the art on all of these things that I've shown you I think are pretty amazing and beautiful, it's not about the product often. Product is often very, very fine and very well made. Each of the artists have a certain mastered skill, you might say. But it's more about the process and allowing seniors and appreciating how seniors work through that creative process for themselves. And so that's my program, my webinar here on memory, art, and aging. And hopefully we can come up with some questions from some people out there. Let's see if there are any questions coming in from folks. If you have any questions, Hannah's going to chime in here in just a few minutes, probably, and share some questions with us.
No questions yet. I would encourage anybody who's still watching to go ahead and head to our Google Plus page and post them there. We'll give you a few minutes, and if there aren't, we'll wrap things up. But please, if you have any thoughts on this, go ahead and post those.
So, give it just a few minutes here. We'll go back through the slides and let you look at some of the artwork that have gone through a little slower or a little faster. Give people till I get to the beginning, and then we'll start it. We'll call it quits.
Okay, still no questions as far as I can tell.
Okay. Well, we'll call this a wrap then. I want to thank everybody, if you're still out there, for joining us on Memory, Art, and Aging, Lessons on Successful Aging in the Arts. Thank you.